Chapter 9 of How to Tell Stories to Children. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Maljem. How to Tell Stories to Children and Some Stories to Tell by Sarah Cohn Bryant. Chapter 9. The Child Mind and How to Satisfy It. "It is the grown people who make the nursery stories," wrote Stevenson. "All the children do is jealously to preserve the text. And the grown person, whether he makes his stories with pen or with tongue, should bring two qualities at least to the work: simplicity of language and a serious sincerity. The reason for the simplicity is obvious, for no one, child or otherwise, can thoroughly enjoy a story clouded by words which convey no meaning to him. The second quality is less obvious, but equally necessary. No absence of fun is intended by the words serious sincerity. They mean that the storyteller should bring to the child an equal interest in what is about to be told, an honest acceptance for the time being of the fairies, of the heroes or the children, or the animals who talk, with which the tale is concerned. The child deserves this equality of standpoint, and without it there can be no entire success. As for the stories themselves, the difficulty lies with the material, not with the child. Styles may be varied generously, but the matter must be queried for. Out of 100 children's books, it is more than likely that 99 will be useless. Yet perhaps out of one autobiography may be gleaned an anecdote, or a reminiscence which can be amplified into an absorbing tale. Almost every storyteller will find that the open eye and ear will serve him better than much arduous searching. No one book will yield him the increase to his repertoire which will come to him by listening, by browsing in chance volumes and magazines, and even newspapers, by observing everyday life, and in all remembering his own youth and his youthful waiting audience. And that youthful audience? A rather too common mistake is made in allowing overmuch for the creative imagination of the normal child. It is not creative imagination which the normal child possesses so much as an enormous credulity and no limitations. If we consider for a moment, we see that there has been little or nothing to limit things for him. Therefore, anything is possible. It is the years of our life as they come which narrow our fancies and set a bound to our beliefs, for experience has taught us that for the most part a certain course will produce a certain effect. The child, on the contrary, has but little knowledge of causes, and as yet but an imperfect realization of effects. If we, for instance, go into the midst of a savage country, we know that there is a chance of our meeting a savage, but to the young child it is quite as possible to meet a red Indian coming round the bend of the brook at the bottom of the orchard as it is to meet him in his own wigwam. The child is an adept at make-believe, but his make-believes are as a rule practical and serious. It is credulity rather than imagination which helps him. He takes the tales he has been told, the facts he has observed, and for the most part reproduces them to the best of his ability. And nothing, as Stevenson says, can stagger a child's faith. He accepts the clumsiest substitutes and can swallow the most staring incongruities. The chair he has just been besieging as a castle is taken away for the accommodation of a morning visitor, and he is nothing abashed. He can skirmish by the hour with the stationary coal-scuttle. In the midst of the enchanted pleasures he can see, without sensible shock, the gardener soberly digging potatoes for the day's dinner. The child, in fact, is neither undeveloped grown-up nor unspoiled danger. Perhaps he has a dash of both, but most of all he is akin to the grown person who dreams. With the dreamer and with the child there is that unquestioning acceptance of circumstances as they arise, however unusual and disconcerting they may be. In dreams the wildest, most improbable and fantastic things happen, but they are not so to the dreamer. The veriest cynic amongst us must take his dream seriously and without a sneer, whether he is forced to leap from the edge of a precipice, whether he finds himself utterly incapable of packing his trunk in time for the train, whether in spite of his distress at the impropriety, he finds himself at a dinner party minus his collar, or whether the riches of El Dorado are laid at his feet. For him at the time it is all quite real and harassingly, or splendidly important. To the child and to the dreamer, all things are possible. Frogs may talk, bears may be turned into princes, gallant tailors may overcome giants, fir trees may be filled with ambitions, a chair may become a horse, a chest of drawers a coach and six, a hearthrug a battlefield, a newspaper a crown of gold, and these are facts which the storyteller must realize, and choose and shape the stories accordingly. Many an old book, which to a modern grown person may seem prim and over-rigid, will be to the child a delight. For him the primness and the severity slip away, the story remains. Such a book as Mrs. Sherwood's Fairchild Family is an example of this. To a grown person reading it for the first time, the loathing propensities of the immaculate Mrs. Fairchild, who never does a hand's turn of good work for anyone from cover to cover, the hard piety, the snobbishness, the brutality of taking the children to the old gallows and seating them before the dangling remains of a murderer, while the lesson of brotherly love is impressed, are shocking when they are not amusing. But to the child, the doings of the naughty and repentant little Fairchilds are engrossing, and experience proves to us that the 20th century child is as eager for the book as were ever his 19th century grandfather and grandmother. Good Mrs. Timmins' History of the Robins, too, is a continuous delight, and from its pompous and high-sounding dialogue, a skilful adapter may glean not only one story, but one story with two versions, for the infant of 18 months can follow the narrative of the joys and troubles, errors and kindnesses of Robin, Dicky, Flopsy, and Pecksy, while the child of 5 or 10, or even more, will be keenly interested in a fuller account of the birds' adventures and the development of their several characters and those of their human friends and enemies. From these two books, from Miss Edgeworth's wonderful moral tales, from Miss Wetherell's delightful volume Mr. Rutherford's Children, from Jane and Anne Taylor's original poems, from Thomas Day's Sandford and Merton, from Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, and from many other old friend, stories may be gathered, but the storyteller will find that in almost all cases adaptation is a necessity. The joy of the hunt, however, is a real joy, and with a field which stretches from the myths of Greece to Uncle Remus, from Le Morte d'Arthur to the Jungle Books, there need be no more lack of pleasure for the seeker than for the receiver of the spoil. The following is a list of valuable sources for the storyteller, all yielding either good original material for adaptation, or stories which need only a slight alteration in the telling. Readers may be interested in A History of Storytelling by Arthur Ramsden. The Bible, Mother Goose's Melody, published by Bullen. The Story Hour by Kate Douglas Wiggin, published by Gay and Hancock. Stories for Kindergarten, published by Ginn. St. Nicholas Magazine, bound volumes, published by Vaughan. Little Folks, bound volumes, published by Cassell. Fables and Nursery Tales, edited by Professor Charles Eliot Norton, published by Heath. Stories to Tell the Littlest Ones, by Sarah Gunn Bryant, published by Harrop. Mother Stories, by Maud Lindsay, published by Harrop. More Mother Stories, by Maud Lindsay, published by Harrop. Aesop's Fables. Stories to Tell to Children, by Sarah Gunn Bryant, published by Harrop. The Book of Stories for the Storyteller, by Fanny Coe, published by Harrop. Songs and Stories for the Little Ones, by Gordon Brown, published by Harrop. Character Training, Stories with an Ethical Bearing, by E. L. Cabot and E. Ailes, published by Harrop. Stories for the Story Hour, by Ada M. Mardials, published by Harrop. Stories for the History Hour, by Nanny Niemeyer, published by Harrop. Stories for the Bible Hour by R. Brimley Johnson, published by Harrop. Nature Stories to Tell to Children by H. Waddingham Sears, published by Harrop. All Time Tales by Florence Dugdale, published by Collins. The Mabinogion, published by Dent. Percy's Reliques, published by Vaughan. Told Through the Ages series, published by Harrop. Legends of Greece and Rome by G. H. Kupfer, Master of Arts. Favourite Greek Myths by L. S. Hyde. Stories of Robin Hood by J. W. McSpadden. Stories of King Arthur by U. W. Cutler. Stories from Greek History by H. L. Havel, Bachelor of Arts. Stories from Wagner by J. W. McSpadden. Britain Long Ago. Stories from Old English and Celtic Sources by E. M. Wilmot Buxton, Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Stories from Scottish History, selected from Tales of a Grandfather by Madeline Atker, Master of Arts. Stories from Greek Tragedy by H. L. Havel, Bachelor of Arts. Stories from the Earthly Paradise by Madeline Atker, Master of Arts. Stories from Chaucer by J. W. McSpadden. Stories from the Old Testament by Mrs. S. Platt. Told by the Northmen. Stories from the Norse Eddas and Sagas by E. M. Wilmot Buxton, Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Stories from Don Quixote by H. L. Havel, Bachelor of Arts. The Stories of Roland and the Peers of Charlemagne by James Baldwin. Teachers in need of good stories should keep themselves acquainted with the development of this series, as fresh volumes are constantly added. The material is precisely the right kind for the storyteller, since the stories have come to us from distant days, when, as a national inheritance of this race or that, they were told in homely cabins by parents to the children, or sung by bards to festive companies. Stories of the English by F., published by Blackwood. Old Greek Folk Stories by Josephine Peabody, published by Harrop. Red-Cap Tales by S. R. Crockett, published by Black. A Child's Book of Saints by William Kenton, published by Dent. Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster by Eleanor Hull, published by Harrop. The High Deeds of Finn by T. W. Ralston, Master of Arts, published by Harrop. The Book of the Epic by H. A. Gerber, published by Harrop. The Myths of Greece and Rome by H. A. Gerber, published by Harrop. Myths of the Norsemen by H. A. Gerber, published by Harrop. Myths and Legends of the Middle Ages by H. A. Gerber, published by Harrop. Hero Myths and Legends of the British Race by M. I. Abbott, Master of Arts, published by Harrop. The Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border. Gleanings in Buddha Fields by Lafcadio Hearn, published by Kegan Paul. The Golden Windows by Laura E. Richards, published by Allinson. Hans Andersen's Fairy Tales. Grimm's Fairy Tales. English Fairy Tales by Joseph Jacobs, published by Knott. Folk Tales from Many Lands by Lillian Gask, published by Harrop. Celtic Fairy Tales by Joseph Jacobs, published by Knott. Indian Fairy Tales by Joseph Jacobs, published by Knott. West African Folk Tales by W. H. Barker and C. Sinclair, published by Harrop. Russian Fairy Tales by R. Nisbet Bain, published by Harrop. Cossack Fairy Tales by R. Nisbet Bain, published by Harrop. The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde, published by Knott. Donegal Fairy Tales by Seamus McManus. In Chimney Corners by Seamus McManus. The Arabian Nights, The Blue Fairy Book and Others by Andrew Lang, published by Longmans. Fairy Stories by John Finmore, published by S. S. Union. The Japanese Fairy Book, published by Constable. Fairy Tales from Far Japan, translated by Susan Bullard, published by Religious Tract Society. In the Child's World, published by Philip. Legends from Fairyland by Holm Lee, published by Vaughan. The King of the Golden River by John Ruskin, published by Grant Allen. The Welsh Fairy Book by Jenkins Thomas, published by Unwin. At the Back of the North Wind by George MacDonald, published by Blackie. Tell Me Why Stories About Animals by C. H. Claudy, published by Harrop. Tell Me Why Stories About Great Discoveries by C. H. Claudy, published by Harrop. Uncle Remus by Joel Chandler Harris, published by Routledge. Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome. Le Morte Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, published by Macmillan. The Boys of Rosar by Henry Newbold, published by Macmillan. Stories from Dante by Susan Cunnington, published by Harrop. The Jungle Books by Rudyard Kipling, published by Macmillan. Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling, published by Macmillan. Wood Magic by Richard Jefferies, published by Longmans. Among the Farmyard People by Clara D. Pearson, published by Murray. Amongst the Night People by Clara D. Pearson, published by Murray. Among the Meadow People by Clara D. Pearson, published by Murray. The Animal Storybook by Andrew Lang, published by Longmans. Wild Animals I Have Known by Ernest Thompson Seton, published by Nutt. A Book of Nature Myths by Florence Holbrook, published by Harrop. More Nature Myths by F. V. Farmer, published by Harrop. Parables from Nature by Mrs. A. Gatty, published by Bell. Northern Trails by W. J. Long, published by Ginn. The Kindred of the Wild by Chas. G. D. Roberts, published by Duckworth. Rap and His Friends by Dr. John Brown. A Child's Garden of Verses by R. L. Stevenson, published by Longmans. A Treasury of Verse for Little Children, compiled by Madeline Edgar, Master of Arts, published by Harrop. A Treasury of Verse for Boys and Girls, compiled by Madeline Edgar, Master of Arts, published by Harrop. A Treasury of Ballads, compiled by Madeline Edgar, Master of Arts, published by Harrop. Bimbi by Ouida, published by Chatter. Stories from Shakespeare by Dr. Thomas Carter, published by Harrop. Stories from the Fairy Queen by Lawrence H. Dawson, published by Harrop. Moral Tales by Maria Edgeworth, published by Macmillan. End of Chapter 9. The Child Mind and How to Satisfy It. End of How to Tell Stories to Children and Some Stories to Tell